On the night of July 16th, 1999, a plane took off from Essex County Airport in New Jersey just after sunset. On board were three people headed to a family wedding in Massachusetts. The flight should have taken about an hour. By the following morning, the entire country was watching the Atlantic Ocean and hoping for something that wasn't coming. The man flying that plane was 38 years old, had been photographed more times than he could possibly count, and had spent his entire life being described as the heir to the most storied political dynasty in American history. He had never wanted any of that. He had spent decades trying to be a person rather than a symbol, and he never quite managed it, because the country wouldn't let him, and neither would his name. This is the story of John F. Kennedy Jr., and it is not the story most people think they know. The salute. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. was born on November 25, 1960, at Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C. His father had won the presidential election just 17 days earlier, defeating Richard Nixon in one of the closest elections in American history. He would be inaugurated in January, 2 months after his son's birth. The country was watching the Kennedy family before John Jr. had any awareness of being watched, before he could form a sentence or recognize his own reflection. He spent his first years in the White House, which is, by almost any measure, an extraordinary setting for a childhood. He played under the Oval Office desk while his father held meetings with advisors and cabinet members. He was photographed running across the White House lawn, being lifted into a helicopter, sitting in his mother's lap. He was photographed constantly by the press and by the White House's own documentary photographers, and the images were charming and widely distributed and helped build the story of the Kennedy administration as something bright and energetic and young. Camelot, as it would later be called, after the Jacqueline Kennedy chose to give those years that name in a magazine interview after her husband's death. His famous nickname, John, was a press invention. A reporter had misheard the president calling his son's name twice in quick succession, and the label spread through newspapers and magazines, even though the family never used it. John was simply John. But John took hold in public consciousness as a diminutive and an endearment, and it attached to him for years before he was old enough to object to it. On November 22nd, 1963, when John Jr. was 2 years old and his sister Caroline was 5, their father's motorcade passed through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, and the world changed. President Kennedy was shot and killed. He was 46 years old. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One, standing next to Jacqueline Kennedy, who was still wearing the pink wool suit she had been wearing when her husband died beside her. 3 days later, on November 25th, the state funeral was held in Washington. It happened to be John Jr.'s 3rd birthday. He stood on the steps of St. Matthew's Cathedral in a pale blue coat and white gloves, and as his father's flag-draped casket passed on its horse-drawn caisson, he raised his right hand in a small, precise salute. The gesture was instinctive, a 3-year-old imitating something he had seen adults do, but it landed with the weight of something far more deliberate. The photographer, Dan Farrell, was there, and later said it was the saddest thing he had ever seen in his entire life. The image was published across the world immediately and has been republished ever since. In 2013, on the 50th anniversary of the assassination, a major American newspaper ran the photograph on its front page again. John Jr. said as an adult that he had no memory of the funeral at all. What that image did, what it set in motion for the rest of his life, was establish him as a symbol before he was old enough to have a character. He was the heir. He was the future. He was the little boy saluting his father's coffin, permanently 3 years old in the American imagination, even as the actual John Kennedy grew up and became someone more complicated and more interesting than any symbol could contain. By December 1963, the family had moved out of the White House. Jackie took the children first to a rented house in Georgetown, and then, in 1964, to a 15-room apartment at 1045th Avenue in New York City, overlooking Central Park. She was determined to give them something approaching ordinary childhood, which required fighting the government's instinct to maintain a large protective infrastructure around them and the press's instinct to photograph everything they did. She was only partially successful at both. The Secret Service stayed. The photographers stayed. The tension between protection and normalcy ran through John's childhood as a constant background condition, and it is probably why he spent his adult life moving as fast as he could, on bikes, on kayaks, in planes, as if speed itself was a form of the freedom he had spent his early years without. Growing up, Kennedy. In June 1968, when John was 7 years old, his uncle Robert F. Kennedy was shot and killed at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, minutes after winning the California Democratic presidential primary. It was the second Kennedy assassination in 5 years, and it arrived in John's life at exactly the age when children begin forming memories that stay. He had not really remembered his father's death at 3. He remembered this one. Robert Kennedy had been a consistent presence in John and Caroline's lives after November 1963, calling, visiting, taking the children places, being the person in the family who understood what it meant to be the oldest male relative of 2 children who had lost their father in front of the whole world. He was not their father, and made no pretense of being their father, but he was there. When Robert was killed, John lost not only an uncle, but the adult male figure who had been most present in the years since Dallas. Aristotle Onassis, whom Jackie married in October 1968, filled no comparable role. John and Caroline barely knew him. He was a separate life their mother had chosen for reasons of her own that had very little to do with her children's needs. John said almost nothing about Onassis publicly for the rest of his life, which was itself a kind of statement. He grew up attending some of the most academically rigorous schools in New York, St. David's, then collegiate school on the Upper West Side, and spent his later teenage years at Phillips Academy Andover in Massachusetts, the same preparatory school his father had attended. He was a decent student, not a standout one. He was better remembered by classmates for his personality than his grades. Warm, quick to laugh, genuinely interested in the people around him in the unperformed way that was actually relatively rare in his social world. He was not slumming it when he treated ordinary people as interesting. He actually found them interesting. He spent a summer in Wyoming in 1978, working as a ranch hand on a working cattle operation, living simply and doing physical labor alongside people who had no particular investment in his name or his history. He came back from it talking about how clarifying it had been to be somewhere that required nothing of him except the work. He kayaked and hiked and rollerbladed in Central Park, and later, when the city made it impossible to be anonymous even in motion, he switched to early morning runs in the dark when the photographers hadn't yet shown up. He was physically restless in a way that people who knew him consistently remarked on. Always moving, always looking for the next physical challenge, as if stillness was something he'd been denied and was trying to recover. He went to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and graduated in 1983 with a degree in American Studies. He lived off campus in a shared house for much of his time there, which was a deliberate choice, a refusal to separate himself from the ordinary circumstances of student life, even though the infrastructure around his name could easily have arranged something more comfortable and more insulated. He was popular there, in the way that someone with genuine charm and no visible contempt for ordinary people tends to be popular. not untouched by his name, because that was impossible, but managing it with a kind of self-aware humour that most people found disarming. He briefly pursued acting at Brown, performing in student productions, and he was good at it. He understood intuitively that performance requires inhabiting a version of yourself, and he had been doing that publicly since before he understood what it meant. One of his close friends from those years later said that John always understood he was playing two roles simultaneously, himself and John F. Kennedy Jr. The acting work, whether he recognized it at the time or not, was the most direct training he ever got for the life he was actually living. After Brown, he enrolled at New York University School of Law. He graduated with a JD in 1989 and joined the Manhattan District Attorney's Office as an assistant prosecutor, working under Robert Morgenthau. He tried cases. He prosecuted real cases against real defendants in real courtrooms, and nobody handed him victories. He was competent, collegial, and uninterested in the shortcuts that his name could easily have provided. He failed the New York bar exam twice before passing it on his third attempt in 1990. When the press made a story out of the failures, and they made a considerable story out of it, running the kind of coverage that compared him unfavorably to his father's accomplishments at the same age, he deflected with a line about not being his father, which was the most honest thing he said about his situation in public during those years. He served in the DA's office for 4 years, accumulating a trial record that included 6 wins and 2 losses, and left in 1993. The tabloids followed him throughout all of this. They named him the sexiest man alive in 1988. They photographed him jogging in Central Park, rollerblading in Lower Manhattan, emerging from his building on North Moore Street in Tribeca with a helmet under one arm. Every woman he was seen with became a story. The relationships that got the most sustained coverage were with actress Daryl Hannah, which lasted on and off for several years in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and which ended badly enough that both parties eventually made their feelings known through intermediaries rather than directly. He had also dated Christina Haag, with whom he had attended Brown, and Sarah Jessica Parker, who later said that she had no idea what real fame looked like until she dated John, and that she sometimes felt she should apologize to him, not for anything she had done, but simply for being someone standing next to him when the cameras arrived. You didn't just date John Kennedy, you dated the machinery that came with John Kennedy, and eventually those things became impossible to separate. Through all of it, he had not run for office. This was the organizing expectation of American political coverage throughout his adult life. The question that hung over every profile, every magazine cover, every public appearance. When would he run? Which seat would it be? The New York Senate race looked like an obvious starting point. The governorship, and eventually, inevitably, the White House itself. His name recognition was essentially universal. His favorability ratings suggested he could win almost any race he chose to enter. He was, in the press's sustained imagination, America's prince, the heir to Camelot, the continuation of a lineage that the country had never quite finished grieving. He resisted it carefully and consistently. People around him said that he was thinking about a Senate run in New York in the early 2000s, and there is credible evidence, including accounts from people who knew him well, that he was moving toward it seriously in the last year of his life. But he had not committed, and the reasons he hadn't committed were ones he understood better than most. He had grown up watching what happened to the people in his family who entered politics. His father had been shot in a motorcade in Dallas. His uncle Robert had been shot in the kitchen of a hotel in Los Angeles minutes after winning the California primary. His uncle Ted had survived Chappaquiddick and 47 years in the Senate, but Chappaquiddick had taken the presidency from him as surely as a bullet would have. John had watched this from inside the story. He knew what the story cost. He was deliberate in a way that other people read as hesitation, but that was actually something more like respect for the weight of the thing he was being asked to carry. What he did instead, in 1995, was something unexpected. He started a magazine, George. In September 1995, John F. Kennedy Jr. launched a political magazine called George, named after the first president, George Washington. It was published by Hachette Filipaki Media and co-founded with a business partner named Michael Berman. The concept was to cover politics the way mainstream magazines covered culture, with celebrity profiles, fashion spreads, and a glossy aesthetic that would attract readers who didn't already follow political coverage. The thinking was not cynical. John genuinely believed that the wall between popular culture and political life was artificial and damaging to civic engagement, and George was his attempt to break it down from the inside. The first cover featured the model Cindy Crawford, dressed as George Washington, powdered wig, colonial coat, bare midriff, and it sold out at newsstands across the country. The launch generated enormous attention, partly because of the concept, and partly because the concept was being launched by John Kennedy, which made it a news story regardless of the content. Initial circulation reached around 400,000 copies, a strong start for a political publication. The magazine ran for nearly 5 years and produced genuinely interesting work during its first 2. John contributed pieces himself, a notable profile-style interview with imprisoned boxing champion Mike Tyson, an essay that referred to his first cousins Joseph and Michael Kennedy as poster boys for bad behavior during a period when both were facing separate scandals, and coverage of Cuba and Northern Ireland that straddled the line between political journalism and personal connection in ways only he could pull off. He also turned down certain interviews that the business side of the magazine would have wanted, Princess Diana reportedly among them, in favor of subjects that interested him more, but sold fewer copies. This was a consistent source of tension. The structural problems deepened in early 1997, when John and Berman fell into an open power struggle. The disagreements became heated, then physical. There was at least one reported altercation between them, and Berman eventually sold his stake and left the company. His departure removed the business architecture that had organized George's operations, and the sales numbers, which had been under pressure before, dropped sharply afterward. The Hachette executive overseeing the partnership later said publicly that the decline reflected John's editorial choices more than the market's appetite, a statement that was partly fair and partly the kind of thing people say about someone who is no longer there to respond. By 1998 and into 1999, George was genuinely struggling, and John was dealing with something more personal running alongside all of it. His cousin Anthony Radziwill, the son of Jackie Kennedy's sister Lee, and someone who had been close to John since childhood, was dying of cancer. Radziwill had been chosen as best man at John's wedding. He was one of the handful of people in John's life who had known him before the mythology fully calcified, who called him John rather than a version of his father's legacy, and watching the illness advance was a private grief that John carried through the last year of his life with very little outward acknowledgement. The magazine was failing. His best friend was dying. And his marriage, which had been the subject of intense tabloid attention since before the wedding day, was under real pressure. Carolyn. He had met Carolyn Bessette in the early 1990s when she was working at Calvin Klein in New York, where she had risen to become the director of publicity for the company's flagship Manhattan store. She was blonde, striking, fiercely private, and absolutely uninterested in being a public figure, which, given who she was with, was an irony that defined their relationship from the start. They dated for several years before becoming engaged, and the relationship was not smooth. The paparazzi followed them everywhere. Every argument that took place in public became a photograph. In early 1996, a video surfaced showing the two in an intense argument in a park, the kind of private moment that people in ordinary relationships have in private, made into tabloid footage by the simple fact of who he was. They married on September 21st, 1996, in a ceremony at the First African Baptist Church on Cumberland Island, Georgia, a remote barrier island off the Georgia coast with no commercial airport and no bridge to the mainland. About 40 people attended. Anthony Radziwill was best man. Caroline Kennedy was matron of honor. The couple had chosen the location precisely for its inaccessibility, and they had managed to keep the event out of the press until the day before. An almost miraculous achievement, given the sustained level of attention that followed John everywhere. The church itself had no electricity. It had particular meaning to the Kennedy family. After Robert F. Kennedy's assassination in 1968, locals on Cumberland Island had held a quiet memorial service there. Their first dance was to Prince's "Forever in My Life." Carolyn's life inside the Kennedy public orbit was, by the accounts of people who knew her well, harder than she had expected it to be. She was not a politician's daughter. She had not been raised in the fishbowl. She had built a career managing other people's public images, which had given her a certain sophistication about visibility. But watching it turned on yourself was something different entirely. The press followed her the way they followed him, photographing her through windows, reporting on her clothing and her expressions and her apparent emotional state, speculating about her marriage, treating her interiority as something the public had a right to. She withdrew from events where she could. She declined appearances that weren't obligatory. The tabloids read this as instability. People who knew her described someone funny, grounded, loyal, and deeply private. Someone who had simply not signed up for the life that had arrived with the man she loved. By 1999, the strain in the marriage was visible enough that it had become part of the public story around them, which made everything harder. It's a particular form of pressure. Having the difficulties of a marriage become a running media narrative while you are still in the middle of living through them. Friends of both later said they didn't think the relationship was finished, only that it was going through something serious, the kind of serious that requires time and privacy to work through, and that the Kennedys had never been given much of either. The July trip to Massachusetts, to the wedding of John's cousin Rory Kennedy in Hyannisport, was a family occasion. Carolyn's sister, Lauren, was flying with them, getting off at Martha's Vineyard before John and Carolyn continued to Hyannisport for the wedding. It was a plan. It was an ordinary plan. It was the kind of thing families do all the time without knowing that it is the last ordinary thing they will do. The last flight. On July 16th, 1999, John had been dealing with a fractured ankle from a hang gliding accident in June. The cast had only recently been replaced with a walking boot, and the orthopedic surgeon who saw him that day noted that his left foot movement was limited but sufficient for flying. He was cleared to go. He had received his private pilot's license in April 1998, 14 months before the crash. He had logged approximately 310 total flying hours, but only about 72 of those were without an instructor on board. In his specific aircraft, a Piper Saratoga he had purchased in 1999, he had logged just 3 hours of solo flying time. He did not hold an instrument rating, which meant he was licensed to fly only under what aviation rules call visual flight rules, navigating by sight rather than instruments alone. He had originally planned to depart earlier in the day with his flight instructor. The instructor had in fact offered to come along on this particular flight, given the conditions. John declined the offer. The departure from Essex County Airport in Fairfield, New Jersey, came at approximately 8:38 in the evening, about 25 minutes after sunset, and around 10 minutes before the end of what aviation authorities call civil twilight. He took off into a darkening sky with haze building over the water. The weather forecast had indicated acceptable conditions, visibility between 4 and 10 miles along the route, clear skies. But the actual conditions over the water, once you were over it and away from any landmarks, were worse than the forecast suggested. Other pilots flying similar routes that night reported no visible horizon over the open water because of haze. At least one pilot cancelled a comparable flight that evening due to what they described as poor conditions. John filed no flight plan. He made no radio calls during the entire flight. The plane proceeded northeast along the Connecticut coastline at 5,500 feet, and for most of the route, the flight appeared normal on radar. Then, about 34 miles west of Martha's Vineyard, as the plane began crossing a 30-mile stretch of open ocean, something changed. The plane began a gradual descent, then a series of turns, then the descent accelerated. The radar data showed what aviation investigators later described as a classic graveyard spiral, a phenomenon that occurs when a pilot loses visual reference to the horizon, becomes disoriented about which way is up, and unknowingly steers the plane into an increasingly steep, descending turn. Without instruments to tell him what the plane was actually doing, and without a visible horizon to give him external reference, a pilot can be completely unaware of how steeply the aircraft is diving. The body's own sensations in that situation are misleading in ways that are well documented and genuinely hard to train away. The plane's rate of descent exceeded 4,700 feet per minute in the final seconds. It struck the water nose first at 9:41 in the evening. The search began within hours of the plane failing to arrive. Air traffic controllers had lost radar contact at 9:41 p.m. By midnight, the Coast Guard had launched search aircraft. By morning, the story was everywhere. The country woke up on July 17th to news that John F. Kennedy Jr. was missing over the Atlantic Ocean, and for 5 days, the coverage was nearly continuous on every major network. Ships searched. Coast Guard helicopters searched. Navy divers were dispatched. The Kennedy family gathered at Hyannis Port and waited. Caroline Kennedy, who had already buried her father and her mother and her uncle Robert, waited again. The ocean near Martha's Vineyard is cold and murky, and it gave nothing back quickly. The debris field was spotted on the water's surface on July 17th. Luggage, seat cushions, a headset, which confirmed the crash but gave no information about survivors. There were none. On July 20th, Navy divers located the wreckage of the Piper Saratoga on the ocean floor, approximately 116 feet below the surface, roughly 7.5 miles southwest of Gay Head on Martha's Vineyard. The 3 occupants were recovered, still strapped into their seats. The medical examiner's report concluded that all 3 died on impact with the water. John was 38 years old. Carolyn was 33. Lauren was 34. Their ashes were scattered at sea from the deck of the Navy destroyer USS Briscoe on July 22, 1999, several miles from the crash site. John had expressed, in conversations over the years, that he wanted to be buried at sea, near his father, whose own burial at Arlington National Cemetery had always felt to John like the possession of a legend rather than the resting place of a person. The 2 families agreed to a private ceremony. For once, in a life that had been observed from its first weeks, there were no cameras. The curse behind the curse. The word curse gets attached to the Kennedy family the way certain words get attached to things people can't otherwise explain. It is, in one sense, a story people tell to make an overwhelming pattern feel legible. Skeptics point out that a large, prominent, extended family will, over several generations, simply experience more tragedies than a smaller and less visible one. That the Kennedy story looks like a curse, partly because every piece of it gets reported. That argument is reasonable as far as it goes, but it stops going very far when you actually list what happened. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., John's uncle, the eldest son of the family patriarch Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., was killed on August 12, 1944, when the military aircraft he was piloting exploded over East Suffolk, England, during a secret wartime mission. He was 29 years old and had been groomed his whole life for a political career. The plan had always been that he would be the first Kennedy president. When he died, that expectation transferred to his younger brother John. Kathleen Kennedy, known as Kick, died on May 13, 1948, when the private plane she was traveling in crashed in France. She was 28 years old. Her husband, the Marquis of Hartington, had been shot dead by a German sniper in Belgium in 1944, barely a month after Joseph Jr.'s death. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. He was 46 years old. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles on June 5, 1968, minutes after winning the California Democratic primary. He was 42 years old. He had been, at that moment, the likely Democratic nominee and possibly the next president. He was shot in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel by a man who had been waiting for him. Ted Kennedy, in 1969, drove his car off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts, on the night of July 18th. His passenger, 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne, was trapped in the submerged vehicle. Kennedy escaped the car. He did not contact authorities for approximately 10 hours. Kopechne did not survive. Kennedy pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident and received a suspended sentence. The incident ended whatever realistic path to the presidency remained available to him. In a televised statement the following week, he said he had wondered on that night whether some awful curse did actually hang over all the Kennedys. He said it as if the question surprised him. It probably didn't. David Kennedy, one of Robert's sons, died in April 1984 in a Palm Beach hotel from a drug overdose. He was 28 years old. As a child, he had watched his father's assassination broadcast live on television. Michael Kennedy, another of Robert's sons, died on New Year's Eve 1997 when he struck a tree while skiing in Aspen, Colorado. He had been playing a game of catch with a football while skiing down the mountain with family members. He was 39 years old. John Jr. had been close to Michael. The two had grown up in the same family gravity, close enough in age to move through their childhoods alongside each other. After Michael died in that Colorado snow, John stopped flying for roughly 3 months. His sister Caroline hoped he would stop permanently. He understood why she hoped that. He started again anyway. Less than 18 months after Michael died, John was gone too. And then, years later, the losses kept coming. Sayest Kennedy Hill, one of Robert's granddaughters, died in August 2019 of an accidental overdose at the Kennedy family compound in Hyannis Port. She was 22 years old. Maeve Kennedy McKean, another of Robert's grandchildren, drowned in April 2020 in a canoeing accident in the Chesapeake Bay. She was 40 years old. Her son Gideon, who was 8, was with her and did not survive either. The accumulation is real. Whether the word curse is the right frame for it is a question that depends on how you feel about probability and pattern. What is not debatable is that generation after generation, across 8 decades, this family has buried people at ages they should not have reached the end of, in circumstances that should not have produced a death. Joe Jr. at 29 over England. Kik at 28 over France, Jack at 46 in Dallas, Bobby at 42 in Los Angeles, David at 28 in Palm Beach, Michael at 39 in Aspen, John at 38 over the Atlantic, Siersa at 22 in Hyannisport, Maeve at 40 in the Chesapeake. John Jr. had grown up inside this accumulation. He had known since the age of 3 that the world could take the people you loved without warning, without reason, without anything that resembled fairness. He had watched it happen to his Uncle Bobby when he was 7. He had watched it happen to his cousin Michael in 1997. He had kept flying anyway, which was either courage or stubbornness, or simply the refusal of someone who had already decided he would not let the weight of his family's story determine the shape of his own life. He had made that refusal quietly and consistently for 35 years. And then, on a July night over the dark Atlantic water, it ended. What he left. The National Transportation Safety Board issued its formal report on the crash in July 2000. The conclusion was precise. The probable cause was the pilot's failure to maintain control of the aircraft during a descent over water at night as a result of spatial disorientation. Haze and darkness were listed as contributing factors. The report was careful not to explicitly use the word inexperience, but the numbers it cited made the point without needing to. 72 hours of solo flight time total. 3 hours alone in that specific aircraft. No instrument rating. A fractured ankle that limited left foot control. Night conditions over featureless open water with a haze thick enough to erase the horizon entirely. His own flight instructor had offered to come along on that particular flight and had been turned down. Another pilot had cancelled a comparable flight that same evening. The families of Carolyn and Lauren Bassett filed a wrongful death lawsuit against John's estate. It was settled in July 2001 for a reported $15 million. The settlement contained no admission of liability. The response from the country was immediate and sustained in a way that surprised even people who had expected an enormous reaction. Time magazine ran a commemorative issue that sold more than 1 million copies at newsstands. A number, the magazine later said, was comparable only to issues produced after major historical events. People lined up outside his apartment building on North Moore Street in Tribeca and left flowers, notes, photographs. Letters arrived at the building and at Kennedy family addresses and at the offices of George for weeks afterward. Many of them were addressed simply to John, New York, as if the postal system would know where to route them. It did. George closed in early 2001, about 18 months after his death. The magazine's final issues were published by Hachette, which had never been able to make the concept work commercially without its founder. The papers and records of his professional life were donated and archived. The Kennedy compound in Hyannisport held a private family gathering. Senator Ted Kennedy, who had by then outlived 3 of his siblings, Joe, Jack, Bobby, and now his nephew, gave the formal eulogy at the memorial service held in New York. He described John as someone who had all the gifts of his father, but who had spent his life trying to be simply John. A person rather than a legacy, a human being rather than a symbol, someone who wanted to matter on his own terms. That was not entirely what happened. The legacy was inescapable, and John had known it was inescapable. But the desire behind it was real. He had spent 38 years trying to live a life that was his own, inside circumstances that made that almost impossible, and he had succeeded at it more than most people in his position would have. He was genuinely liked. He was genuinely kind. He had prosecutors who worked alongside him in the DA's office who said he was one of the best colleagues they'd had, someone who showed up, did the work, and never once used his name to make things easier. His cousin Anthony Radziwill, best man, lifelong friend, the person who had known him before the mythology fully settled, died of cancer 1 month after the crash. He was 40 years old. The cancer had been diagnosed years earlier. John had known, going into the summer of 1999, that he was likely watching his closest friend die. That knowledge was part of the weight he carried on that July evening when he climbed into the cockpit and flew northeast into the dark. The photograph still circulates. The 3-year-old boy in the pale blue coat, standing outside St. Matthew's Cathedral, right hand raised in a small, precise salute as his father's casket rolls past. He never remembered the moment. The country never forgot it. It was the image that defined him before he had any say in what would define him, and it followed him for 35 years until the ocean took him, and that following finally stopped. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.